June 4th, 1943, Railroad Street, Mejia, Texas. Unafitzia Verer Burkhart's pencil trembled slightly in his hand as he quietly scribbled in his hidden diary. If discovered, these entries would be enough to land him in solitary confinement by his own officer. The Americans must be deceiving us. No nation could be this wealthy while fighting a war on two fronts. Through the train window, Burkhart had just witnessed a scene that completely shattered 3 years of Nazi propaganda. Electric lights illuminated every farm, every street corner, every shop. The entire Texas plain glowed like a starry night sky at 10 p.m. In Germany, since 1940, blackout orders had plunged the Third Reich into darkness. Even before the war, rural electrification had only reached 20% of farms. But here, in what Berlin's propaganda called a decadent and crumbling America, electricity flowed like water. 1,850 veterans of the Africa Corps disembarked from the train. Not a cattle car, not a freight car, but comfortable Pullman carriages with cushioned seats, dining cars, and sleeping berths. The entire population of Mejia poured into the streets to witness the scene. None of them knew that this moment would usher in one of the most profound psychological transformations in modern history. The systematic collapse of Nazi ideology, not by bombs, but by the productive power of America. That collapse had actually begun on May 13th, 1943, in Tunisia. General Eugen von Arni, Rommel's successor, surrendered along with approximately 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian soldiers, the most seasoned desert warriors of the Wehrmacht. Those who had pushed the British to the brink of Egypt, those who had earned the reluctant respect of Montgomery, were now prisoners of war. Among them was Headman Friedrich, a first-class Iron Cross recipient who had fought in France and been wounded twice in North Africa. His diary, found decades later in the U.S. National Archives, became one of the most detailed accounts of the psychological shock experienced by German prisoners of war while held in the United States. The journey from defeat to awakening began at the port of Oran, Algeria, as Radka and over 30,000 other prisoners were held in temporary camps awaiting transport. The organizational efficiency of the American military began to shake preconceived notions. Thousands of prisoners were processed daily with a precision far exceeding anything the Wehrmacht had ever achieved. Even at its peak, identity cards were photographed and filed, medical examinations and full vaccinations were given. Rights under the Geneva Conventions were explained in fluent German by American officers specially trained for this task. But the real shock came from the food. Oberleutnant Jens Müller, captured with the 21st Panzer Division, wrote to his mother 8 months later. In the Oran camp, the Americans gave us better food than at any other time during our 6 months of fighting in the desert. White bread, real coffee, meat twice a day. We thought it was propaganda. We didn't realize it was just their standard ration. The Liberty ships that carried prisoners across the Atlantic were also symbols of American industrial power. The SS Robert E. Peary was built in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at the Kaiser shipyard in California, a figure that, if known, the Germans would have dismissed as propaganda. At the height of production, the U.S. built 3 Liberty-class ships a day. Instead of returning empty, they carried human cargo, up to 30,000 prisoners of war per month in the summer of 1943. The 2-week voyage in July 1943 became the next phase of morale collapse. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division wrote in a letter to his family, "The American sailors threw away more food each day than our entire company received in a week in Africa. They threw away half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, expired milk, not to mock them, but because to them it was nothing. Their supplies were unlimited. The ships became a floating classroom of American power. Prisoners learned that the ship carrying them was just one of 2,710 Liberty-class ships built during the war, each composed of 250,000 parts from 32 states, with engines manufactured in 3 different factories. August 2nd, 1943. Norfolk, Naval Base, Virginia. The first glimpses of America shattered the last vestiges of Nazi propaganda. Norfolk Base spanned over 4,300 acres, with wharves stretching for miles, cranes operating incessantly, unloading dozens of ships simultaneously. In a single day, the port handled more cargo than the German port of Hamburg handled in a week. Prisoners were lined up to board trains. Along the way, they passed parking lots filled with the port workers' cars. In Germany, private cars are the privilege of the rich and high-ranking party members. The Volkswagen for the people has remained an empty promise since 1934. Here, ordinary workers drive their own cars to work. And then came the next shock: trains. Not freight cars, not the 40 people or 8 horses of Europe, but proper passenger carriages. Cushioned seats, sleeping berths, dining cars with white tablecloths, and silver cutlery. Radka wrote, "We boarded the train as tourists, not prisoners." A U.S. sergeant even apologized for the malfunctioning air conditioning in the carriage. Air conditioning midogas, something they had once believed only existed on Hitler's private trains. The 3-day journey across America had destroyed Nazi ideology more thoroughly than any military defeat. Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, every small town was brightly lit. Factories ran night shifts. Billboards lit up. Houses had lights on in multiple rooms at once. One prisoner wrote, "Each small town had more electricity than all of Hamburg. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee stretches over 3 kilometers along the riverbank. The plant's electric furnaces consume 175,000 kilowatts, more than the entire city of Munich. Near Louisville, trains slowed down as they passed rubber from barren fields. In just 18 months, massive synthetic rubber production complexes have sprung up. Each plant employs thousands of workers and produces a total of 800,000 tons of rubber annually. Despite being the country that invented the technology, Germany has never exceeded 120,000 tons in its best year of production." Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist who had worked for IG Farben, immediately understood the significance of the scene. In a post-war interview, he recounted, "I immediately recognized the distillation towers, the catalytic cracking units. Each plant was more modern than anything we had ever built. And there were 4 plants in one place." They said there were dozens more across the country. Lieutenant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist who had worked for IG Farben, immediately understood the importance of that scene. In a post-war interview, he recounted, "I immediately recognized the distillation towers, the catalytic cracking units. Each plant was more modern than anything we had ever built. And there were 4 plants in one location." They said there were dozens more throughout the country. Outside Detroit, trains run past Ford's Willow Run plant, visible from miles away. The plant, built in just 9 months, produces one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. At its peak, 42,000 workers assemble aircraft from 1.55 million components, supplied by 1,500 subcontractors, spanning 2.5 million square feet. It consumes more electricity than the entire city of Cologne. Hauptmann Werner Levy, a Luftwaffe pilot, shot down over Tunisia, pressed his face against the windshield. He counted 17 B-24s at various stages of completion. "We were taught that American planes were of poor quality, hastily assembled, and prone to failure," he wrote. "But I saw the assembly line, the precision, the quality. They were not inferior at all. They were just produced faster than we could have imagined." The deeper we went into America, the more complete the collapse of the Nazi myth became. In St. Louis, the train crossed the Mississippi River on the Eads Bridge. Below, barges loaded with grain lined up one after another, each carrying enough food to feed an entire German city for months. Unterscharführer Karl Schmidt, the son of a Bavarian farmer, wrote in his diary, "The Americans transport food just like we transport ammunition. Unlimited, no shortage." The deeper we went into America, the more complete the collapse of the Nazi myth became. In St. Louis, the train crossed the Mississippi River on the Eads Bridge. Below, barges loaded with grain lined up one after another, each carrying enough food to feed an entire German city for months. Unterscharführer Karl Schmidt, the son of a Bavarian farmer, wrote in his diary, "The Americans transport food just like we transport ammunition. Unlimited, no shortage. One barge carried enough wheat to feed my entire village for 5 years." The crane operator ate a sandwich with more meat than our weekly ration. In Kansas City, the train stopped near a massive cattle market. Tens of thousands of cattle awaited slaughter. The smell of meat wafted for miles. The soldiers who had lived on 200 grams of meat a week in North Africa watched American workers eat beef sandwiches during their lunch break. Jeff writer Paul Fisher wrote, "They eat meat like we eat bread. Now they eat meat like we wish we could eat bread." A guard bought them hamburgers from a counter near the station. Meat, cheese, vegetables, white bread, 15 cents. He bought 20, paying with a $1 bill without thinking. "This is nothing special," Fisher wrote. "This is their everyday food." The train's final destination was the prisoner of war camps in Texas and Oklahoma. But for many, the real shock was only just beginning. Camp Hearn, Texas, built in just 4 months, held between 3,000 and nearly 5,000 prisoners. Living conditions far surpassed anything most soldiers had ever known, even as civilians in Germany. The wooden barracks had electricity, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heating. Each barracks used more wood than even small German villages. The hospital within the camp stunned the German doctors. Oberstleutnant Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, realized that the facility was better than most civilian hospitals in Germany. X-ray machines, surgical instruments, medicines, things that had disappeared from Germany since 1941 were standard here. They had penicillin, Bauer later recounted. The miracle drug that we had only heard about, they used it even on prisoners with mild infections. While German soldiers died from a lack of sulfa drugs, the Americans gave us the best they had. If the train station and the Pullman trains shook initial confidence, the prison camp kitchen was where the real breakdown began. Prisoners assigned to work in the kitchen at Camp Hearn quickly realized they were entering a completely unfamiliar world. Not a field kitchen, not cast iron pots on charcoal stoves, but a fully industrialized system. The cold storage was large enough for a truck to enter. There was a high-powered electric mixer, automatic dishwashers, gas stoves capable of cooking thousands of meals simultaneously. Every day, the kitchen prepared food for over 5,000 people. The rations included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread. Things that ordinary Germans hadn't seen in such quantities since 1939. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, a hotel chef in Munich before the war, recorded in his diary, "Today we threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years. Not because it's spoiled, just because there was too much. American regulations require a 10% surplus to ensure no one goes hungry," he continued. I cried as I threw the perfect loaves of bread into the trash. By September 1943, the labor shortage in American agriculture led the government to begin using German prisoners of war for work outside the camps. This pragmatic decision inadvertently became the most powerful blow to Nazi ideology. Every morning, groups of prisoners were transported by truck to fields, warehouses, and processing plants. They weren't blindfolded. They weren't led around in circles. They could see everything. Corn and wheat fields stretched to the horizon. Factories operated 3 shifts continuously. Shops were full of goods. Parking lots were packed with cars. Houses had refrigerators, radios, and washing machines. At a cotton separator near Houston, Unafitzia Verer Burkhart witnessed the machine process more cotton in an hour than his entire village in Germany could produce in a month. The plant was powered by the Colorado River Authority, part of a rural electrification program that brought electricity to 90% of Texas farms by 1943. The rancher wasn't an aristocrat, nor a party member, Lang wrote. Just an ordinary farmer, but he had electricity, running water, a truck, a car, and a tractor. His workers, including black men, brought lunchboxes with more food than a German worker's weekly ration. And what puzzled Lang most, nobody considered it special. In Nebraska, German prisoners of war were sent to work in sugar beet fields. There, they witnessed agricultural mechanization on a scale they had never imagined. A single combine harvester replaced the labor of 100 people. The fields were so vast that in Germany they would be considered an entire district. American farmers spoke of yields with a casual air. 60 bushels of wheat per acre, while even the best soil in Germany only yielded about 30. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, who worked near Scottsbluff, wrote, "The farm owner's 16-year-old son drives a motorcycle worth more than I've earned in my entire life." When Hoffmann expressed his surprise, the boy just laughed. That's not even a good one. The most dangerous things happened to the prisoners of war working near the industrial plant. According to the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war were not allowed to participate directly in weapons production. However, they were permitted to work in indirect industries, freeing up American labor for the front lines. This legal loophole allowed thousands of German prisoners of war to witness firsthand the power of American industry. At a Campbell Canning factory in New Jersey, prisoners saw a production line processing more tomatoes in a single day than a German factory could process in a month. The factory operated with a minimal workforce. Women and the elderly, as the young men were fighting in the war. Yet, production still exceeded peacetime standards. Ernst Wagner, who worked in a food factory in Germany, recorded everything was automated. Electric conveyor belts, automatic filling machines, boilers processing hundreds of cans at once. An elderly woman sat supervising the control panel, a job that in Germany would require 50 people. Near Detroit, the prisoners worked at a power plant, unloading coal from trains. From there, they could see the River Rouge complex across the river. This complex employed 100,000 workers, producing jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks. Its daily electricity consumption exceeded that of Hamburg. Obergefreiter Franz Kellner wrote, "We saw the parking lot, thousands of workers' cars. In Germany, even the officers rarely owned cars. Here, the workers drove to work." The guard added that many families owned 2 cars, one for work, one for family. "We thought he was mocking," Kellner wrote, "but no, it was the truth." By the winter of 1943, the cumulative effects of these experiences began to be reflected in American intelligence reports. Supervisory officers called the phenomena ideological collapse syndrome. The prisoners became increasingly less argumentative when presented with production figures. They no longer objected. They had seen too much. Major Paul Noël of the Special Monitoring Unit reported in December 1943, "The most fanatical prisoners became silent. They still loved Germany, but no longer spoke of victory. Many began to question what they had been taught about America. If labor and material conditions had shaken the faith of the German prisoners of war, it was information that shattered it from within." The Americans understood one thing very well: no coercion, no direct debate. Just let the truth speak for itself. From mid-1943, in many prison camps across America, a new phenomenon emerged. Camp newspapers. These weren't propaganda newspapers. No slogans, no images mocking Hitler. Just simple printed newspapers, written in standard German, presented in a dry, sterile style, exactly like pre-war European journalism. The names changed from camp to camp: Dorf, Jaibruki, Washimposhi. The content also seemed harmless. Weather, sports, agricultural prices, daily life in America. But on the inside pages, things began to change. The camp newspaper reproduced verbatim articles from neutral American, British, and Swiss newspapers. No editing, no commentary. The numbers appeared coldly. U.S. steel production in 1943. Number of Liberty ships launched each month. Number of bombers produced in a week. No comparisons, no conclusions. But it was this silence that was terrifying. Gefreiter Karl Bowman wrote in a letter to his wife, a letter that was censored and archived. "They didn't tell us that Germany would lose. They just printed the figures, and I couldn't find a way to refute those numbers." Alongside the camp newspaper was an even more sophisticated program, a movie theater. Once or twice a week, prisoners were invited to watch films. Not compulsory, no roll call. Those who didn't want to watch could stay in the barracks. Initially, the films were entertainment, cowboys, comedies, musicals. Laughter erupted, a rare occurrence in the prison camp. Then, the content began to shift subtly. Documents about American agriculture, films about factory workers, films about middle-class family life. No mention of Germany. No mention of the Nazis. Only showing a society functioning normally, efficiently, without fear. By the end of 1943, screenings began to include war films, but not American propaganda films. These were newsreels, filmed from various fronts with neutral narration. One segment silenced many prisoners completely. B-17s leaving the production line, long lines rolling out of the factory. Not fighter planes, just images of machinery, workers, and clocks. Unteroffizier Riens Muller recorded, "We were taught that America was weak, chaotic, and undisciplined. But that assembly line operated like a perfect machine. Emotionless, just production." The most powerful psychological blow came from a seemingly harmless event. Christmas, 1943. The Americans decided to celebrate Christmas for the German prisoners of war, not for propaganda, because it was Christmas. A Christmas tree was erected in the camp. Candles, cakes, coffee, cigarettes. Familiar carols were sung in German. Many American guards, mostly of German, Austrian, and Swiss descent, participated. There were no speeches, no political messages, Only one thing perplexed the prisoners. They were treated like human beings. Obergefreiter Ludwig Seidel wrote, "I can't understand. If we are the barbaric enemy that the press says, why are they giving us Christmas?" That night, in many camps, prisoners of war voluntarily organized discussions. No American officers participated. For the first time, questions forbidden in Germany were voiced aloud. If the Americans are evil, why do they treat us like this? If they are a decadent society, why does everything work so well? If the Germans are a superior race, why are they failing in production? No one gave a definitive answer, but old beliefs were no longer intact. American intelligence officers noted a noticeable change after Christmas 1943. The prisoners of war gave fewer Nazi salutes. There was less political debate. Many began reading books, learning English, and asking about life after the war. Major Edward Davison reported, "We didn't break their loyalty to Germany, but we shattered the myth in which they were nurtured. Not all German prisoners of war changed. As trust began to crumble in the majority, a small group became even more radicalized. These were the officers and non-commissioned officers, absolutely loyal to the Nazis. They viewed any doubt as betrayal, any question as a sign of moral decay. In the prison camps, a parallel society gradually formed. By day, they followed American discipline. At night, in the barracks, they established their own order. Those suspected of being weak were monitored. Those who read the camp newspaper too intently, spoke English, or showed admiration for American life were recorded. The initial forms of punishment were very subtle. Isolation in daily life, public humiliation, whispered threats. The list will be available after the war. Some prisoners called it the shadow court. Jeff Hans Richter wrote, "We were in America, but every night we lived in the same fear as back home. Not fear of the American guards, but fear of our own comrades." In Sami camps, violence began to appear. At Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, a prisoner who had declared the war was over was found hanged in the toilet. The death was recorded as suicide, but most prisoners understood it was a warning. Similar incidents, beatings at night. Accidents during labor occurred sporadically throughout the camps in late 1943 and early 1944. It is noteworthy that the Americans knew American military intelligence was not only monitoring individuals, but also their thoughts. They soon realized that if the Nazi elements gained control of the camp's internal affairs, all efforts at re-education would collapse. But their solution wasn't mass repression. They chose a colder strategy. First, they categorized the prisoners. The most fanatics were quietly transferred to separate camps, unofficially called hard camps. There were no camp newspapers, no movies shown, no labor outside the camp, only discipline, time, and isolation. One American officer noted, "Let them live with their beliefs. No arguing." With the rest, the majority of the Americans did the opposite. They stripped the Nazis of their tacit authority. The prisoners who were trusted in daily life were given barrack representatives, not high-ranking German officers, but calm, non-extremist individuals. Small decisions, assigning tasks, communal leaving gradually ceased to be in the hands of the fanatics. Soft power was cut off. The next step was profoundly psychological. Making the fear transparent, American guards began speaking directly to the prisoners. Letters were kept after the war. There was no revenge list. The Nazis would not exist to return. New threats. No excessive reassurance. Just the truth, spoken slowly, repeatedly. By mid-1944, the atmosphere in many camps had changed dramatically. The fanatics became isolated. They still shouted slogans, but without an audience. Meanwhile, other prisoners began to defend each other. When one was threatened, the others testified to the American officers. This had previously been unthinkable. Unteroffizier Martin Vogel wrote, "For the first time in my life, I saw Germans resist the Nazis without fear." For Americans, this was the most important sign. Not because the prisoners were patriotic Americans, but because they were no longer afraid of the Nazis. An internal report concluded, "When fear disappears, ideology dies with it." On the morning of June 6, 1944, not a single shot was fired in the German prisoner of war camps on American soil. But that was the day everything changed forever. The news didn't come through speeches or loudspeakers. It appeared the way Americans always did, as a regular news bulletin. The camp newspaper that morning ran a short headline, "Allied forces land on the Normandy coast." No exclamation points, no appeals, just a sentence. Initially, many prisoners thought it was propaganda. The fanatics scoffed, arrayed, then they'll be thrown into the sea. But then the numbers appeared, thousands of ships, tens of thousands of soldiers, hundreds of supporting aircraft, and most importantly, the map. The map showed the bridgehead wasn't a single point, but a series of interconnected areas. No comment needed. No conclusion needed. Those who had served in the German army understood what that meant. During the work sessions outside the camp, the news continued to be reinforced. American farmers turned on their radios. The midday news repeated the same information in the same neutral tone. No one celebrated in front of the prisoners. New Juan mocked. It was simply the event unfolding. Jeff writer Paul Newman wrote, "When the same news appeared in the camp newspaper, the farm radio, and the guards' words, I knew there was no turning back." A few days later, the camp newspaper added a small entry. Transport output exceeds expectations. No mention of Germany. No mention of defeat. But for the prisoners who had witnessed American factories, American ports, American ships, that statement meant nothing. This wasn't a reckless operation. This was a machine. By the end of June 1944, the tone in the camp had changed dramatically. The debates had ceased. The emphatic pronouncements were gone. Instead, there was a prolonged silence. Silence in the barracks. Silence during meal. Silence even among the remaining fanatical groups. One American officer noted, they weren't asking, is Germany losing? They were starting to ask, what will happen after the war? Another, more subtle sign emerged. The prisoners began to care about news from home, not the war, but the civilians. Which cities were bombed? Did the families still have a home? Were any letters delivered after the war? In their minds, the war had shifted from glory to consequences. By the fall of 1944, the moral collapse was almost complete. When news of Paris liberation arrived, there was no violent reaction. Only slow nods. Unteroffizier, Rolf Steiner, wrote, I no longer felt defeated, only the feeling that everything was over, even though we were still wearing our uniforms. American officers realized one crucial thing. There was no need to force prisoners to admit defeat. There was no need to force them to abandon Germany. Just let reality take its course. A report at the end of 1944 concluded the war was over in the minds of most German prisoners. It was only a matter of time. As 1945 approached, many prisoners of war prepared for the next chapter in their lives. Learning a trade, learning English, asking about returning to Germany, asking about reconstruction. They no longer talked about victory. They talked about tomorrow. In May 1945, the war in Europe officially ended. In the German prisoner of war camps on American soil, there were no cheers, no chaos, just another morning. But everyone understood the old world had collapsed. The camp newspaper that day published a short headline. Germany surrenders unconditionally. New comment. No further lines. The prisoners' reaction was unlike what the Americans had feared. New rebellion, no collective despair. Neither was there an outburst of hatred. Instead, there was a weary silence. Many sat for hours staring out at the camp yard. Some wrote letters, knowing they wouldn't be sent immediately. Others quietly put away their Nazi insignia, epaulets, and badges. No one asked them to. Unteroffizier Georg Meyer recorded, I didn't feel defeated. I just felt I had lived in a fictional story. After the surrender, a big question arose. What would happen to us? The Americans didn't answer with promises. They answered with procedures. The prisoners were kept for many more months, even more than a year. Not as punishment, but to stabilize Europe and prepare for repatriation. During that time, educational programs were expanded. Modern European history, how parliaments work, citizenship rights, what is a free press? Not compulsory. New exam. Anyone who wanted to learn. One thing surprised many prisoners. The Americans let them read the latest German newspapers. Not Nazi newspapers, but the first newspapers published in the occupied territories, exposing concentration camps, war crimes, files on the Nazi Party. Many refused to read, but many others couldn't stop. Jeff writer Otto Brandt wrote, "I found the name of my city on the camp list. I lived 30 kilometers away and said I knew nothing." By 1946, the repatriation process began. Prisoners boarded ships, this time not Pullmans, but troop carriers sailing across the Atlantic. The feeling of victory was gone. Only one other worry remained. What kind of Germany were they returning to? Many returned to ruined cities, families separated, society shattered, but they carried something they hadn't had before: the experience of living in a non-dictatorial society. Many former prisoners of war later became teachers, engineers, local mayors, journalists, business people. They didn't become Americans. They became other Germans. In post-war interviews, one phrase came up repeatedly: "We didn't learn democracy from books. We learned it in prison camps." Later historians assessed that the detention of over 370,000 German prisoners of war in the United States was not just a military solution, but a massive social experiment. New Tochtery, no brainwashing, new coercion, just clear laws, dignified treatment, undistorted information, and allowing people to compare for themselves. A report by the U.S. War Department concluded after many years, the detention of over 370,000 German prisoners of war in the United States was not just a military solution, but a massive social experiment. New Tochtery, no brainwashing, new coercion, just clear laws, dignified treatment, undistorted information, and allowing people to compare for themselves. A report by the U.S. War Department concluded after many years, we didn't make them love America. We just showed them another option. Today, many American military cemeteries in Europe are cared for by the descendants of former German prisoners of war, not out of duty, but out of memory. The memory of a place where they were defeated, but not destroyed.